Hello, welcome to the
Hello.
Like-Minded podcast. Today we're here with Remmel. Do you want to introduce a little bit what has been your working experience and what your background is?
Okay, well that's a big question because I've worked in many different areas, both in private sector, Fortune 500 companies, as well as in government and in consulting, and also with the university. So that bridges many different areas of leadership and organization development in many specific functions.
How does organizational development usually look like? Or if a company has contacted you, what do you usually start with? Or is it like something specific that they want for you, or do you just go there and say what's wrong and how do we solve this?
Well, usually they would come because either they're introducing a major change, so that's often the issue that drives it, or they're looking for more efficiencies, more effective ways of doing things. So they have an idea of a problem. But what often happens is that once you're consulting, you discover that the problem, in fact, is different or it's multifaceted. And so there's always an exploration stage where you're actually kind of defining what it is that needs to be done.
How did you first get into this industry? Or
No, I have a very circuitous route. So I started up actually in occupational therapy, moved from there to family therapy, and really got interested in systems change. So when you do systems in a family approach, that translates pretty nicely into what happens in organizations. Dysfunctional families are not that different from dysfunctional organizations. So I got into that, started doing my master's work and then my PhD work. And I was really interested in what made for effective leadership. And so the route for me was coming through the health system and then going into general consulting.
but what would you say are generally the biggest similarities, or what are usually the issues that you have encountered?
The biggest similarities between which?
Like how a family is dysfunctional and a
Ah,
company is
well,
dysfunctional.
role confusion. So sometimes if you think about a family where the children are in charge, often creates great challenges. Or if you have a person in the family that has significant mental health issues, well, you see some of the same kinds of concerns and issues in companies. And dysfunctional organizations have some of the same dynamics that I saw when I worked as a family therapist.
But would you say that strong leadership or very strict parenting is usually the better approach than like being like very friendly or at the same level as?
Well, strong leadership depends on how you define strong. Strong leadership, where it's clear who is in charge, is creates less confusion. But a lot of our focus in organizations has moved to a more collaborative model. So it is different than families. And in that sense, systems theory only works to a certain extent. In organizations, having role clarity is very important, especially during a time of change. So I worked with organizations where we brought two organizations together. That's not that different than when you bring two families together into a blended family. The rules, the social interaction, the communication patterns, the who does what, all of that has to be worked out. That happens in families, but that also happens between large organizations. And often mergers do not work as well as they might. They might work technically, they might work in terms of um, even in terms of role clarity, but the cultures are different. So you're bringing two cultures together, and that's been some of the most interesting work I've done.
Do you have any examples or like how it has played out in real life?
Sure. Probably the biggest one I was involved with was one of our large banks in Canada, acquired banks in the US. And the anticipation was that, it financially made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense for us to acquire this company. But in fact, we found that the big challenge was just how we did business, that the values and how we treated customers, all of that cultural difference was what became the big challenge. And we worked on that project for several years because it isn't easy to change behavior.
What are usually the key techniques? Or if, for example, I have a company and I think that the culture maybe isn't the best and I have some ideas, then how do I introduce this to my workers or people who are used to something much different?
Well, that's exactly what leadership often requires. Leadership requires you to paint a picture of this is the end result of what we want to see, and then help people either to develop skills or to change their roles in an organization or to introduce technology. I mean, all of those are kind of steps to saying, here's the vision of what could be. And so that's a major function for a leader, is to be able to paint a clear vision of where you are going and what that means for the individual, because the individual is having to experience that change, and change is scary for most people. So if a company says we now want to go in the direction, for example, of greater collaboration between two departments, that means that you are breaking some of the norms that have always been there, and that means a period of discomfort. And again, it's also the leader's role to help people through that period of discomfort.
Are there often people who can't make that change or who eventually have to leave the organization because it's not possible? Or do you feel like a great leader cannot always move along with a full team, even if those big differences are happening?
You can't always move everybody. And I think that that's unfortunately one of the realities. You have early adopters, those are the people who are gung-ho. You have kind of a middle group of people that you can gradually get to adopt the change. But there are people who can't. And if a company is very humane about it, they might move them into a different function. But it also sometimes means departure.
Have you ever had a company come to you and you realize quickly that all the problems they're facing are because of the leader or the person who first contacted you?
Yes, that can happen. And that's where executive coaching often comes in. So that if you know that a lot of what needs to change has to happen with that individual, before you can start working with the team, you actually have to start working with that individual. Now, in many companies, there are mentoring programs. And so you would find somebody within the company who can work with that leader. But often that is where executive coaching comes in, because that leader is going to be absolutely critical for making the bigger change happen.
And you had those issues? Have you told anybody that you are eventually the issue here?
Well, you wouldn't quite phrase it that
Like
way.
that. Oh, like nice, friendly. Oh, we have this.
Well, you might
Yes.
say that there are skill sets that they need to learn.
Yes.
That it would be really helpful if they learned these particular skills. And when I did my doctoral work, I looked at high trust leaders and low trust leaders. And one of the things that emerged out of that was that for people who weren't trusted very much, it was very hard for them to implement change. And so, learning to communicate more effectively, learning to engage with your people, those were all things that the leaders had to demonstrate first before we could make the change happen.
How will you create trust between you and your workers, or where is the border of becoming too friendly instead taking them as family and friends and just creating this healthy trust?
Yeah, family and friends isn't the way to go.
Yes.
Creating trust is keeping your word.
Okay.
Being clear about your communication, not changing it every other day, and we have lots of examples of how not to do it in our current environment. So the stability that comes from knowing that a leader will keep their word, communicate effectively, and engage in a way that also listens to the concerns of the employee. So those are some of the elements that make change possible.
But if you have done courses with students or people who are not maybe very leader, like what are some first fundamentals you would teach a person?
Well, it's a very large area, and I would start with saying that one of the best things to do is to get a good read of your own strengths and weaknesses. And there are tests involved for that, and often leaders will go through a battery of tests before, especially in large organizations, before they're moved into a position. So if you understand your own strengths and you understand what you need to work on, it's much easier to move on, to move into a leadership role.
But do you think leadership is something that in most cases comes naturally to somebody, or is this something that can be taught?
It's a combination.
Yes.
It's not either or. There are people who absolutely resist, they don't want to be leaders. And there are people who naturally want to organize, want to work with others. So there is something that's inherent, but there's also skills that can be learned. And a lot of the work that I've done has been with managers improving their leadership skills. So those are skills that can be acquired.
Do you agree with the statement that has been often said that in large corporations or organizations, people raise to the level of their incompetence, that they're really good at something and then they get promoted and then they're actually not good at it?
There's two ways of looking at it. Sometimes people get put into a position that they're not ready for. And so it isn't a matter of incompetence, it's a matter of have the conditions been created to make them successful. And I'll use the example of doctors because I did work in healthcare. And so you can have somebody who's very competent technically as a physician, but now they're in charge of a unit of people. And their expectations are that everybody can perform at the same level as they do, taking into account what a team works like and who's on that team are critical pieces that aren't necessarily taught in many of the medical programs. Now, there is a lot of focus on team in healthcare, but sometimes somebody who is technically really excellent, it isn't that they come to the level of a competence, but rather the skill sets that are required in running an organization are different than the skill sets that they have in their area of specialty. Equally true for engineers, equally true for anybody who has a very well-defined specialization, and running an organization is in fact a different skill set.
How do you learn that without doing it? Is there like some things you could learn before you start taking on this, like those like bigger roles, or is it just something that comes gradually toward you?
In some organizations, you move step by step, but that's also why people go and get a master's in either business administration or in organizational development, so that they're acknowledging that their technical skills aren't necessarily what they need to manage 2,000 people. And so it's recognizing it isn't so much that it is in fact a different level of skills and of thinking that they need to develop, and often that does take extra training. So in one of my last positions, we created a corporate university. And the corporate university was designed so that our managers, who were all engineers, would actually learn the leadership skills that they would need to lead the organization.
What do you think makes a person successful in life?
Well, generally successful in life is, I would say it's a combination of commitment. It's always hard work. But I also like to emphasize that it's also empathy. It is being able to connect with people. Because to really get things done in life, it's not just that you have a skill set in a particular discipline, but that you know how to work with people. And that's a big piece of leadership, is understanding it's not just getting the task done, but it's how you get it done. That's important.
But if you were to meet a younger version of yourself, like for example, you meet yourself, you're 15 years old, starting to look at the life around you, what would you tell her or what advice would you give yourself?
I think my advice would be that it's not just getting things done, but it is learning to manage upward and manage with the people around you. That the people skills are as important as are your technical skills. And especially if you want to go higher up in an organization, those political skills become even more critical.
Do you think it is possible to get good enough in people's skills or I guess conversation and talking with people that you can get along with everybody or do effective work with even people who are very, very different from you?
I think it's always going to be a challenge, and some of the challenges with working with difficult people, you can run courses on that, on how to manage difficult people. You can be guaranteed that in any job, you're going to find difficult people. You will find them. And so it's learning how to manage them so that the work still gets done and the conflict doesn't get escalated. I mean, there are courses on conflict resolution, there are courses on managing challenging dynamics. And that's also part of organization development, is both identifying what are the challenges that you're running into, as well as learning the skills to manage them.
What do you think is the best way? For example, if I were to be in a job where there is somebody who is making my life very difficult, or what is the key strategy? Is it like kind of keeping your distance or trying to talk it out with the person, or how do you see it work?
It depends a little bit on the situation. I think if you're in a leadership role, you don't have an option but to deal with this person. And what your approach is depends on how you assess them. If you assess that this is somebody who you can give feedback to, that's great. If it's somebody who is not likely to listen to you in the first place, then you might have to find a way around the problem. And that might be repositioning them as to where they work, or having somebody else be the mentor to them. So it isn't always a direct approach. It can be an alongside approach. It can also be that it's not a good fit where they are in that particular role. And so if it's possible to shift them.
How do you create authority? For example, if you're naturally a very friendly, happy, bubbly person, then how do you create this other sort of profile to yourself that's very authority-like and maybe like people listen to and people like want to listen to?
Some of that is communication style. And women in leadership have sometimes speaking habits that take away from their authority, that make you question whether they are as knowledgeable as they are. And so that's really coaching and communication. But authority also comes from standing by what you believe in and being very clear about what you expect. Authority can't be that you leave things vague. If you're in a leadership position and you're expecting certain kinds of actions, clarity, good communication, and I would say that underneath all of that is a value system, that you gain authority because people respect you and you respect them. And that respect comes from consistent action.
Do you think it is often that people, or especially women in business, have to change their personality when they enter a work environment, or is it something that should be done? Like, should you be cooler, maybe less talkative, and like very like
Very serious.
yes.
Well, it's interesting because I think some women as leaders can be very effective using a different style. It doesn't have to be an authoritarian style. It can be that you still believe in collaboration. You still encourage people, but there is a fine line between, I am your friend and I am your leader. And that's where I think women sometimes assume that the only way to work with others is just to be a friend, and that's not the case.
But now, if you would have to send our listeners off with one idea that they should focus with in their businesses or in their life, what would you want them to take with them from this interview?
The one thing I would say about leadership is that it's an ongoing learning process. That if you stop learning as a leader, you stop growing yourself. And so that's a lifelong process, and I encourage everybody to think about it that way. What worked in one company may not work in another. You may need to learn new skills, and that's a good thing.
Thank you so much for coming.
You're very welcome.